Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring plants. Flowering Evil by Margaret St.Clair. No Pets Allowed by Monette Cummings. Green Grew the Lasses by Ruth Laura Wainwright. The Masked World by Jack Williamson. Beast of Prey by J. Williams. Flowering Evil by Margaret St.Clair. Originally published in Planet Stories, Summer 1950. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Captain Björnson shook a grizzled head. "I never saw a plant I liked the looks of less," he said. "I don't know how he got it through the planetary plant quarantine. You take my advice, Amy, and watch out for it." He took another of the little Gila nut cookies from the quaint old lucite platter and bit into it appreciatively. Mrs. Dinsmore sniffed. "I don't know what you're driving at," she said coldly, "or why you're so prejudiced against my poor little Rambler. You know perfectly well that Robert would never send me anything the least bit dangerous." Captain Björnson paused with another cookie halfway to his lips and looked at her. "Wouldn't send you anything dangerous?" he exclaimed. "Why, Amy, have you forgotten how your face was swelled up for 2 weeks from that tree cutting he sent you? The doctor said it was a contact poison worse than sumac, and he tried to get you to go to the hospital. What about the time that cactus from the Blue Desert went to seed, and I spent 36 hours picking spines out of you? What about—" Mrs. Dinsmore gave a warning sniff. "Well, all right," Björnson said. "I know how fond you are of Bob, and I know you don't like me to mention his mistakes. I'll grant you he means well. So what? He's flighty, scatterbrained, and brash. To use an expression that was current when I was a boy, Bob is a twerp." Mrs. Dinsmore pulled the lucite platter so far over to her own side of the table that Björnson couldn't get another cookie from it without getting up and stretching out along the tablecloth. "I don't agree with you," she said distantly. "Robert is a splendid fellow, so thoughtful and considerate. He takes a real interest in my soap carvings, and how many young men with an important position like his, third mate on a space freighter with a regularly scheduled run, would remember to send back plants from every port of call to an aunt on Earth? I shouldn't be surprised if I won a blue ribbon at the flower show again this year. My golden rain plant is about to bloom. Robert tells me it's a lovely thing." The captain cast a wistful look at the cookie plate. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you," he replied. "When's Bob due in port?" Mrs. Dinsmore's face relaxed. "Around the 25th, he said. He sent me a gram. Here, have another cookie. I must think up some little thing to cook for him as a surprise." The captain snuffled a handful of cookies from the plate and stood up to go. "Your ordinary cooking is good enough for me," he declared. "But if you mean something like those little shrimps fried in batter you had the last time he was here, go ahead, and watch for that plant." He stalked off across the lawn. "He's getting old," thought Amy Dinsmore, watching the gruff old codger limp around a flower bed. Björnson had a prosthetic surgery after he lost his foot, and, though it had been successful, grafts were never as flexible as natural members. Positively old. He ought to see a geriatrician right away. She'd tell him so the next time he came to see her, talking about Robert that way. She set the dial on the robot gardener on the front lawn to weeding dandelions, and started along the path that led to the little hothouse where most of the plants Robert had sent her were growing. Even in the deep tropics, Terra was, with few exceptions, too cold and dry for them. The Martian subjects, on the other hand, were in a cycroplex lean-to, with hygroscopes and a battery of infrared lamps to keep the temperature up during the day. The heavy, moist air of the hothouse made Amy Dinsmore pant a little as she entered it. But how interesting it was! Even the leaves of her Venusian plants were fascinating, thick and leather-like, thin and dry and hard like parchment, hanging in heavy serpentine coils or bristling pointed and sharp as so many spears. And the colouring ranged from cerise through a silky taupe and indigo around to an angry bright metallic blue. As for their flowers, oh my! Amy Dinsmore had never seen anything like them. All you could do was stand in front of them with your mouth open and stare. When she wasn't looking at her Martian succulents, they were her favourites of anything she grew. She halted in front of the plant Robert had sent her last. Yes, Hjalmar Björnsson was getting definitely senile. How could anybody think that his poor little dried-up thing could be harmful? It was a mere bundle of desiccated stems, with only a tiny new leaf or two to indicate that it was alive. It looked a little better than it had yesterday, though. The colchnine solution must have been good for it. Amy brushed a few dead flies from the ledge behind it into her hand and threw them into the composter. She liked to have things neat. Now, what should she cook as a surprise for Robert? He was fond of sweet things, of course, but it always seemed to her that he praised her meat dishes and entrees most. He liked her cooking so much because her roast turkeys and grilled steaks had a crust on them. Electronically cooked food was quick to prepare, and it might be as good for you as they said it was, but the outside looked like the inside, and it all tasted flavourless and grey. What was the use of saving time in cooking if you ended up with food that wasn't any fun to eat? "You aren't looking well, Amy," Captain Björnsson said 3 or 4 weeks later. He looked at her with the critical attention of an old friend. "You've got on a lot of Cosmilac, but you still look peaked. What's the matter? Worried about Bob? Ships don't get hurt in meteor swarms anymore." He looked down at his grafted foot reminiscently. "Not like it was when I was a third mate." Amy Dinsmore shook her head. She picked up one of the brightly coloured hexagons. They had been playing a desultory game of marula in the airy coolness of the side stower, and fiddled with it. "I haven't been sleeping well," she confessed at last. "I've had such unpleasant dreams. Horrid things." "What about?" Björnsson asked. "That blasted plant? Honestly, Amy, it looks like some kind of spider to me." "No, I don't know why you can't leave my Venusian rambler alone. Robert told me it was a very valuable plant, rare even in its own habitat. It's doing so nicely, too. A spider! I wish you'd stop trying to spoil it for me." "I'm sorry," Björnsson apologized. "Forget it. Go on, tell me about your dreams."
"Well, on Tuesday, or was it Wednesday? No, it must have been Tuesday, because that was the day after I flew over to Hartford. I was down by the hothouse, and I found the most unpleasant thing beside the path." She shuddered. "I've been dreaming about it ever since."
"What was it?" Björnsson urged.
"Oh, I guess it must have been a rabbit once. One of the wild ones. Only it was nothing except some fur and some bones. Not decayed, Hjalmar, you understand. Just gone. I can't imagine what had happened to it."
"Better see a mental hygienist," the captain advised after a pause. "Nightmares can be very serious."
I suppose so. I really dread going to sleep.
The next morning, very early, Amy turned on the fluor with unsteady fingers. What a horrid dream it had been! She could hardly believe that it hadn't been real, and that she was safe and sound in her own bedroom after all. Outside, the noise that had wakened her, the jagged, unearthly caterwauling of a couple of tomcats promenading in the moonlight, came again. Ordinarily it was a noise Amy disliked very much. The poor things always sounded as if they were in deadly agony. But now she was glad to hear it. Heavens! If it hadn't been for those cats crying and waking her up, she might still be asleep and dreaming. Dreaming about blood. She turned the ceiling selector to summer sky, lay back on her pillow, and tried to relax. It was her favourite of all the ceilings her bedroom had, so lovely and calm and blue, and right now she needed something lovely and calm. One thing was sure, she wasn't going to stand this much longer. She didn't believe in pampering herself, but if she had that dream once more, she was going to take Björnsson's advice and see a mental hygienist. She'd think about something pleasant. Amy tried to fix her mind on her gardening, on how well her plants were doing, but it wasn't a success. When she tried to keep her thoughts on a Venusian rambler, why did they call it a rambler? It was turning into a large, stocky, compact bush, more like an outsized camellia than anything else Amy Dinsmore could think of. They kept veering back to her dream, and all that. Well, then she'd think about Robert. She was a lucky woman to have a nephew like him. She'd worked out several menus, all the things he liked best, but she wished she could think of something a little different. There were so few kinds of meat, when everything was said and done. Lamb and beef and muskox and bollo and pork, and she always thought bollo was stringy and tough. Gradually Amy's nerves began to quiet. The cats had grown quiet too, except for an occasional outburst that sounded like lightning made audible. Her thoughts drifted lazily from Robert to her soap carving. After a while she went to sleep. The morning was sunny and bright, and she felt almost ashamed of herself for having let a dream affect her so seriously. She had finished her matutinal inspection of the hothouse and the succulent growing shed, and had started back to the house when she came on a bundle lying by the hothouse wall. At first she didn't recognize it for what it was, and stooped over it, poking at it with a stick. After an instant she straightened, nauseated, remembering where she had last seen that ginger-coloured fur. The bundle was a not very bulky remains, bones and some patches of hide, of a cat. Hadn't there been some pieces of white fur too? Of 2 cats. She'd better call Hjalmar. It might be dangerous. There must be some wild animal living near her hothouse, a lynx or ferret or wildcat or stoat. Mrs. Dinsmore wasn't strong on zoology, but she knew exactly what sort of an animal she had in mind. Something lithe and dark and bloodthirsty. Goodness, it was quite frightening. On the other hand, Robert would be in port in a couple of days. If she asked Hjalmar to help her, he'd either make an enormous masculine fuss over it. She still remembered the time she'd asked him to put up a towel rack for her, and he'd arrived with a set of socket wrenches, a hand electric drill, 4 pairs of pliers, and a portable arc welding outfit. Or he'd pooh-pooh and pish-tush her into silence. Either way, it wouldn't be satisfactory. She'd wait for Robert. Robert was so comforting. If only she didn't have more of those dreams.
Despite her apprehensions, her next night's slumber was profound and sweet. She hadn't felt so rested and refreshed in weeks. She put the somni-spray. Maybe if she'd thought to use it before, she wouldn't have had those horrid nightmares. Back in the closet, and decided that she'd do some soap carving after breakfast. She felt in the mood for it, and Robert would be disappointed if she didn't have something new to show him that she'd carved since he had last been in port. Besides, she might be able to think of the special dish she wanted to make for him while she was working. She'd found from experience that some of her best culinary ideas came to her while she was making a statuette or plaque out of soap. The meal concluded, she got out her set of modelling knives and a couple of cakes of soap. Soap was rather hard to get, since most people used synthetic detergents nowadays, but she knew a little store in Perth Amboy that carried it. This last batch had a lovely texture. Amy rotated the living room on its axis until the light was exactly right, and then sat down in front of a carving desk. What should she make? A statuette? A plaque? A plaque in low relief, a plaque of a flower. Somehow, she didn't want to think about animals right now. She had sketched in the conventionalized homodactylus and was beginning to pick it out carefully from the background when it occurred to her that she hadn't been down to the hothouse this morning to see her plants. Why, that would never do. She mustn't neglect them. It was terribly important. Important. Her head hurt. How dizzy she felt. She'd better go at once. She'd better go. Cake of soap in one hand, knife in the other. Panting a little, Amy set out toward her plants in a stumbling run. She was halfway to the hothouse before it occurred to her to question the impulse which had taken her incontinently from her carving and set her in blind motion toward the hothouse. And by then it was too late. She was no longer a free agent in any sense of the term. The mental grip which had taken the rabbit and the cat to their death had tightened on her inescapably. Remote from her body, in a glassy paralysis of fear and impotence, Amy watched her feet moving briskly down the path. Oh, if she could only cry out, call Hjalmar! She felt the muscles of her throat straining, but no sound came. And now she was standing before the hothouse, and her hand had opened the door. The Rambler was waiting for her. Very slowly, like a man flexing his arm, it reached out one of the stocky branches toward her. Amy saw that the end of the branch, well hidden under the dark green glossy leaves, was a slender, translucent, hollow thorn. It was about the size of the hypodermic needle the doctor had used when, in her last year's physical examination, he'd taken a sample of blood. Amy knew exactly what was going to happen. First, the hollow thorn until her veins were dry, and then the slowly opening maw, gaping above the big, swollen, meter-wide base the thick leaves of the Rambler had served to conceal. It would take a long time, but Hjalmar would never miss her before it was too late. The Rambler's branch moved delicately over the surface of Amy's right wrist, the one with the modelling knife. The other branches were drooping limply away from the purple pink of its swollen base, waiting, while it hunted the exact spot. It hesitated for an instant, and then Amy's mouth drew into a soundless O of pain, struck home. A dark fluid began to stain the hollow thorn. For just a fraction of a second, the Rambler's mental grip on Amy Dinsmore relaxed.
She could feel its blind concentration on its own black enjoyment. And in that fraction of a second, Amy threw the cake of soap in her left hand straight into the Rambler's fleshy maw. The Rambler gripped at her mind again, but it was a disturbed and feeble grip. Its branches began to move around the fleshy bowl they had shielded, slowly, and then in a furious heaving. The thorn which had entered her wrist was jaggedly withdrawn. Amy, her wrist streaming blood, stared at the Rambler for a moment, and then lunged at it with the menacing knife. Sitting outside on the ground beside the hothouse afterward, her forehead on her hands, feeling sick and faint, Amy had an idea. At first she pushed it from her. It was far-fetched, silly, even a little repulsive. But was it so silly after all? And as to being unpleasant, well, buffalo meat commanded enormous prices in the market, and, from everything she'd ever heard, the buffalo was the very reverse of a fastidious feeder. Even pigs certainly weren't dainty in their eating habits. If she parboiled it in several waters and then braised it slowly, with a hint of ginger in the sauce, well, after all, why not? Amy, the modelling knife in her hand, went into the hothouse again. "Gee, Aunt Amy, this meat's good," Robert said. He was talking with his mouth full. "I've eaten indigenous chow on 3 planets, 4 if you call the stuff they serve you on Uranus food, and it's my opinion that there isn't a better cook anywhere in the system than you. Fact. How do you do it, anyhow?" Amy Dinsmore lowered her eyes. She could feel herself blushing through her cosmilac. "Oh, thank you, Robert." "She sure is, Bob," Hjalmar Björnsson said expansively. "That gravy! She's the best cook on Terra all the time, but when you're in port, she gets sort of inspired. What kind of meat is this, though, Amy? And could I have some more?"
"Of course," Amy said. She refilled Hjalmar's plate. "It's something new I found in the big autumn market in the city," she said vaguely. "By the way, Aunt Amy," Bob said, laying down his fork, "after I sent you that plant, I heard it was supposed to be carnivorous. I forgot to mention it in my last gram. You didn't get into any trouble with it, did you?" "No, it died," Amy said smoothly. "I had to throw it out. Too bad." She brightened. "Pass your plate, Robert dear," she said.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. No Pets Allowed by Monette Cummings. Writing as M.A. Cummings. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, August 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I can't tell anyone about it. In the first place, they'd never believe me, and if they did, I'd probably be punished for having her, because we aren't allowed to have pets of any kind. It wouldn't have happened if they hadn't sent me way out there to work, but you see, there are so many things I can't do. I remember the day the chief of vocation took me before the council. "I tried him on a dozen things," he reported. People always talk about me as if I can't understand what they mean, but I'm really not that dumb. "There doesn't seem to be a thing he can do," the chief went on. "Actually, his intelligence seems to be no greater than that which we believed our ancestors had back in the 20th century. "As bad as that?" observed one of the council members. "You do have a problem." "But we must find something for him to do," said another. "We can't have an idle person in this state. It's unthinkable." "But what?" asked the chief. He's utterly incapable of running any of the machines. I've tried to teach him. The only things he can do are already being done much better by robots." There was a long silence, broken at last by one little old council member. "I have it," he cried. "The very thing. We'll make him guard of the treasure." "But there's no need of a guard. No one will touch the treasure without permission. We haven't had a dishonest person in the state for more than 3,000 years. "That's it, exactly. There aren't any dishonest people, so there won't be anything for him to do. But we will have solved the problem of his idleness." "It might be a solution," said the chief. "At least a temporary one. I suppose we'll have to find something else later on, but this will give us time to look for something." So I became guard of the treasure, with a badge, and nothing to do, unless you count watching the key. The gates were kept locked, just as they were in the old days, but the large key hung beside them. Of course, no one wanted to bother carrying it around. It was too heavy. The only ones who ever used it, anyway, were members of the council. As the man said, we haven't had a dishonest person in the state for thousands of years. Even I know that much. Of course, this left me with lots of time on my hands. That's how I happened to get her in the first place. I'd always wanted one, but pets were forbidden. Busy people didn't have time for them, so I knew I was breaking the law. But I figured that no one would ever find out. First I fixed a place for her and made a brush screen so that she couldn't be seen by anyone coming to the gates. Then one night I sneaked into the forest and got her. It wasn't so lonely after that. Now I had something to talk to. She was small when I got her. It would be too dangerous to go near a full-grown one, but she grew rapidly. That was because I caught small animals and brought them to her. Not having to depend on what she could catch, she grew almost twice as fast as usual, and was so sleek and pretty. Really, she was a pet to be proud of. I don't know how I could have stood the 4 months there alone, if I hadn't her to talk to. I don't think she really understood me, but I pretended she did, and that helped. Every 3 or 4 weeks, 3 of the council members came to take a part of the treasure, or to add to it. Always 3 of them. That's why I was so surprised one day to see one man coming by himself. It was Grem, the little old member, who had recommended that I be given this job. I was happy to see him, and we talked for a while, mostly about my work and how I liked it. I almost told him about my pet, but I didn't, because he might be angry at me for breaking the law. Finally, he asked me to give him the key. "I've been sent to get something from the treasure," he explained. I was unhappy to displease him, but I said, "I can't let you have it. There must be 3 members. You know that." "Of course, I know it, but something came up suddenly, so they sent me alone. Now, let me have it." I shook my head. That was the one order they had given me, never to give the key to any one person who came along. Grem became quite angry. "You idiot!" he shouted. "Why do you think I had you put out here? It was so I could get in here and help myself to the treasure." "But that would be dishonest, and there are no dishonest people in the state." "For 3,000 years, I know." His usually kind face had an ugly look I had never seen before. "But I'm going to get part of that treasure, and it won't do you any good to report it, because no one is going to take the word of a fool like you against a respected council member. They'll think you are the dishonest one. Now, give me that key." It's a terrible thing to disobey a council member. But if I obeyed him, I would be disobeying all the others, and that would be worse. "No!" I shouted. He threw himself upon me. For his size and age he was very strong, stronger even than I. I fought as hard as I could, but I knew I wouldn't be able to keep him away from the key for very long, and if he took the treasure, I would be blamed. The council would have to think a new punishment for dishonesty. Whatever it was, it would be terrible indeed. He drew back and rushed at me. Just as he hit me, my foot caught upon a root, and I fell. His rush carried him past me, and he crashed through the brush screen beside the path. I heard him scream twice. Then there was silence. I was bruised all over, but I managed to pull myself up and take away what was left of the screen. There was no sign of Grem, but my beautiful pet was waving her pearl green feelers as she always did in thanks for a good meal. That's why I can't tell anyone what happened. No one would believe that Grem would be dishonest, and I can't prove it, because she ate the proof. Even if I did tell them, no one is going to believe that a flycatcher plant, even a big one like mine, would actually be able to eat a man. So they think that Grem disappeared, and I'm still out here with her. She's grown so much larger now, and more beautiful than ever. But I hope she hasn't developed a taste for human flesh. Lately, when she stretches out her feelers, it seems that she's trying to reach me. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Green Grew the Lasses by Ruth Laura Wainwright. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, July 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The September evening was hot and humid, and Helen Raymond, watching her husband pace nervously about the living room, grew tenser by the minute. Robert would walk up to an open window, sniff abstractedly, move to the next window, and repeat the performance. "For goodness sakes, Robert, what are you snuffling about?" she finally demanded in exasperation. She had been on edge ever since her cousin Dora had arrived that afternoon. Dora had lost another of a long succession of short-lived jobs, and, as usual, had descended on them without warning for an indefinite visit. Wasn't it enough to have to bear that and the heat too, without Robert's acting up? "Smog's getting worse all the time," Robert complained. Dora lifted her nose to sniff daintily. "It is an odd smog. Now in New York we don't—" Her voice trailed off and left the sentence hanging as she drew in another sample of the night air. Helen sniffed too. "We look like a bunch of rabbits," she thought irritably. But Dora was right. It was an odd smog, sort of sweet and bitter at the same time. Not sulphuric like most of the smog they were used to, or the spoiled onions frying in rancid fat smell of oil wells when the wind was off the land. This odour made her think of rank tropical weeds, a jungle miasma, though she had never been near a jungle. There was something familiar about it, though, and then she remembered that her hands had smelled like that the morning after she had weeded the tiny garden alongside their house. The flower bed had been cluttered with weeds of a kind she had never seen before, horrible-looking things. Could they be the cause of that awful smell? They had sprung up everywhere lately, and, while she had pulled them out of their own garden, they were growing all over, and she couldn't very well weed the whole town, could she? Wait, I want to get something," she said, and ran outdoors. She came back with a sample of the weed, one that she pulled from the garden of the vacant house next door. The plant was about a foot high, with a straight, stiff stem of a bright metallic green, with a single row of inch-wide rosettes of chartreuse leaves or petals down one side of the stem. There could be no doubt about its being the cause of the unpleasant odour, and Helen held it out at arm's length. "What the heck is that?" Robert asked.
"Smell," she said.
"Phew! So that's it. What is it anyway?"
Helen shook her head. "Never saw anything like it until recently. I pulled them out of the garden, but they're all over." Helen carried the offending plant to the back door. When she came back, Robert peered at her intently, shut his eyes, and shook his head quickly, and then stared at her again. "Think you'll know me next time you see me?" she asked, annoyed. "First good look I've had at you this evening. What kind of face powder is that you're using? Don't tell me that peculiar shade is the latest fashion." Puzzled, Helen put her hand to her face as if she should be able to feel the colour. "Mum's green," chortled 8-year-old Bobby. "You ought to see yourself." "Green?" Helen asked worriedly.
"Green," Robert said. "You feel all right?"
"Anemia," Dora declared positively. "You don't eat properly. Not enough vitamins. Now, while I'm here—"
A quick look in the mirror, and Helen told herself that she wasn't really a green, just sort of greenish, if you looked at her in the right light. By morning, the odd colour ought to be all gone. There was no sense in worrying. Anybody could look sort of off-colour now and then. Maybe Dora was right. She was anemic. But she was stunned by the first sight of herself in the mirror the next morning. There was no mistaking it this time. She was as green as grass, and Dora, too, was beginning to show signs of becoming that unbecoming colour. Reluctantly, Dora conceded that it might not be the diet after all. She hadn't been there long enough for it to have that much effect. Robert and Bobby were still shockingly normal. Whatever can it be?" Helen asked shakily, holding out her green hands. The only answer was a hysterical screaming that sent them all racing to the front door. The Raymonds lived in a typical California court, with 4 small houses facing 4 other small houses across a central walk that ran at right angles to the street. On this walk, most of the tenants were now gathered, and the Raymonds and Dora joined them. Helen didn't know whether to feel relieved or more dismayed when she saw that all the women and girls were as green as she, and just as terrified. Someone, of course, had called the police, and a prowl car hummed to a stop at the curb. A harassed, white-faced policeman leaned out of the window. "We're doing all we can," he called. "It's like this all over town. Don't know yet what caused it, but we're investigating." The car sped away. It was soon apparent that only Mimosa Beach was affected. Why, no one could guess. Some said it was all a publicity stunt of some kind, advertising a movie or television show, or a chlorophyll product, perhaps, but they couldn't explain how it worked, or why only women and girls were affected. And how could it possibly help sell anything? Overnight, Mimosa Beach became famous and infested with reporters and colour photographers, all male. There would have been a mass exodus if there had been any place to go, but other communities, fearing that their womenfolk would catch the greenness, like measles, refused to let them in. Besides, in Mimosa Beach they had the dubious comfort of all being alike, while elsewhere they would have been freaks. There was so little they could do to make themselves look attractive. The cosmetics they had, or that were available, were all wrong, but they did the best they could, though there was no hiding that ghastly green complexion. "What a shame your hair isn't red," Dora said one day to Helen. "Amy Olsen now, her hair really goes with green skin." Cocking her head to one side, she studied the younger woman intently. "Your hair, that mousy brown, wonder if we couldn't touch it up just a wee bit." Helen clenched her teeth against the coy, criticizing voice. "I'm not the flamboyant type," she said. Dora was as green as Helen by this time, and it certainly wasn't a bit more becoming to her. She seemed to be enjoying the publicity, though. Besides, it gave her a good excuse for not leaving. If only the greenness had come before Dora, they might have been spared one calamity. 4 girls moved into the house next to the Raymonds, the last house in the row. Neither the Raymonds nor Dora noticed that they had moved in. They came so quietly.
The houses in the court were furnished, and they must have paid the rent, obtained the keys, and walked in, all settled as soon as they closed the door behind them. It wasn't until they rang the Raymonds' doorbell in the early evening that anyone in the household was aware of them. "We move next door," one of them said brightly to Helen when she answered the door. "We come see you, get acquainted. We come in?" "Of course," Helen said, and they trooped in. "We're the Raymonds, and this is my cousin, Dora Hastings." The new neighbour who had spoken first pointed to her companions, one by one. "Patricia Pontiac," she said. "Clara Ford. Mary Maroon. Me," poking a thumb at her own midriff. "Jack Jones." "Jack Jones?" Helen repeated. "That's a man's name." "Man?" the girl asked blankly. "Man," Robert said impatiently. "Like me." The four girls noticed him for the first time, and then they saw Bobby. They stared at the two of them, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with horror. They drew closer to each other, as if for protection, and shivered. Robert and Bobby looked at each other in bewildered embarrassment. "My husband and son," Helen said tartly. Did these odd creatures think all males were wolves, including 8-year-old Bobby? That colour," Mary Maroon quavered. "Not green." "Only dames are green," Bobby scornfully said. "Imagine," Dora tittered nervously. "Afraid of Robert and Bobby?" "Won't you sit down?" Helen asked. This nonsense of being scared of her menfolk had gone on long enough. She didn't want them to sit down. She wanted them to go. But she could hardly ask them to do that. Naturally, they sat down. Bobby turned on the television for a space opera, and the four new neighbours watched it avidly. When the spaceship landed on what was supposed to be Venus, they giggled behind their hands and looked at each other sidewise. Hadn't they ever seen a show like that before? What was so unusually funny about this one? When the commercial came on, Robert turned off the sound. Mary Maroon looked at Bobby, and then at Helen, who was sitting with her arm around her son. "You baby?" she asked. Helen smiled proudly. "Yes, this is my baby." Bobby squirmed indignantly. Mary Maroon then turned to Robert. "You got baby?" Robert said, "Sure, this is my baby," patting Bobby on the knee. To Helen he muttered, "What does she think, anyway?" The four stared at Robert and Bobby and Helen in such obvious confusion that Robert jumped up nervously to turn the sound back on. After the girls had gone home, Bobby was sent off to bed, and Robert, loosening his tie, demanded, "What's the matter with them anyhow? Do they have to stare at me as if I were a damned biological error? Don't they know what a man is, for heaven's sake?" "Really, Robert," Dora protested, blushing a deeper green. "Well, for gosh sakes." "Those names," Helen said. "Clara Ford, that's not too bad, but I'm not so sure about Mary Maroon." Dora nodded. "Mary White, Mary Black, so why not Mary Maroon? But Patricia Pontiac." Helen threw up her hands. "They must have made that one up. But Jack Jones." "Crazy, if you ask me," Robert said, pretending they were scared of me and Bobby. "There's a Patricia beauty shop next to the Pontiac agency," Dora suggested. "Maybe—" "Funny way to get a name. Where the heck are they from?" Robert wondered. "Must be from right here in town," Helen reminded him. "Otherwise they wouldn't be green." "You know, the greenness looks sort of natural on them," Dora said thoughtfully. "Well, think I'll go to bed." After she had gone, Helen said wistfully in a whisper, "If only awful things could sort of counteract each other in the way some poisons do." She started making up the Davenport bed. Dora had their room. "First Dora's coming, and our turning green, and now those crazy girls right next door. But 3 poisons. No, it wouldn't come out even." It was a day or two later when Helen found her new neighbours working in the little flower bed alongside the house. They were busily transplanting weeds of the kind responsible for the unpleasant odour. "For goodness sake!" Helen exclaimed, disgusted. "What in the world do you want with that stuff? Why, it took the rest of us here in the court days to get it all out, and now you want to bring it back. Throw it away." "Oh, no," Patricia Pontiac objected, holding a bunch of the weeds against her heart protectingly. "It's faneweed." "You mean you've seen the stuff before?" Patricia nodded. "We have it all over where we come from. Must have faneweed." "But you couldn't have come from someplace else," Helen pointed out. "You wouldn't be green if you did." "All green where we come from," Mary Maroon said. "I don't know where that stuff, faneweed you call it, came from," Helen said, refusing to pay any attention to their claim that they came from someplace else where everyone was green. There just wasn't any such place. "We drop seed other time we come," Patricia said. Then she added indignantly, "You no believe we come from other place?" "What other place?" asked Helen with weary politeness. "You call it Venus." "That picture the other night," Clara Ford giggled. "Not like Venus at all. So funny." Helen could stand no more. "So are you," she said rudely, and went into the house. They were even crazier than she'd thought. Greener, too, when you saw them in broad daylight. Did the greenness affect the mind, and the greener you got, the zanier you became? Would she get to be like that? The idea frightened her. "No turn green?" Patricia Pontiac asked Robert plaintively one day, as if she were blaming him for her bewilderment. "No," he answered shortly, "but I don't blame you for envying us men. It must be tough to be that lousy-looking colour." "Green is good colour," Mary Maroon declared stoutly. "You no have baby yourself?" "Of course not." Patricia turned to Helen. "Then what's she for?" "He," Robert corrected, then added sarcastically, "Papa works to buy baby shoes. Now does that answer your question?" Helen sighed. There was just no use trying to explain anything to those 4 girls. Fall and winter passed. The dull monotony of being green was accented now and then by articles and pictures in newspapers and magazines, and by rumours, always proved false, that a remedy had been found, though chemists, biologists, and doctors continued hunting for the cause of the catastrophe. Autopsies provided no clue. Women protested that the doctors were looking at them with a wishful drop-dead expression, as if the next autopsy might be the one that would supply the answer. The greenness was still confined to Mimosa Beach. Other communities kept up their quarantine. The 4 girls next door to the Raymonds were as zany as ever, and Dora Hastings stayed on, of necessity. And then the monotony was broken by greater calamities. First, there was the matter of Patricia Pontiac's approaching motherhood. While this, of course, made no difference as far as the town was concerned, Dora was greatly perturbed, and, ever being one to insist on others keeping within the limits of her own narrow paths, she took the girl to task. "Patricia," she insisted sternly, "there simply must be a man to blame for your condition. You must marry him. Think of the baby. You want him to be fatherless?" "Fatherless? Him?" Patricia repeated, frowning in perplexity. "What are you talking about? My little baby girl, all mine. This man business I don't understand." "Nonsense. You're just trying to pretend innocence." "Oh, give it up, Dora," Helen urged wearily. "She doesn't know what you're talking about." Dora raised sceptical eyebrows. "In her condition?" After that, Dora went around with a great air of virtue condescending to help the wayward. It must be a burden, Helen felt, to have to feel superior because of other people's faults, such a negative sort of superiority. During the next few weeks, Dora had plenty of chance to feel superior. Other unmarried girls and women besides Patricia became pregnant, and, like Patricia, they insisted no man was responsible. But they were not complacent about it the way Patricia was. To them it was an indignity they did not deserve. "What's this town coming to anyway?" Dora demanded. "Parthenogenetic births, maybe," Helen ventured. No one would have believed that we'd turned green, but we did. Honestly, Dora, I'm getting so I'd believe almost anything in this nightmare existence of ours, even that you are about to have a baby." "That," Dora rejoined acidly, "is not at all likely. But are you trying to imply that our turning green could have something to do with these shameful births?" "I didn't say that, but you could be right." "Humph," Dora snorted. "A lot of nonsense." The 4 girls were in the Raymonds' living room one afternoon, a week later, talking with Helen, when Dora, who had been feeling ill and had gone to the doctor's, walked in. She glared at the 4 girls. "I'm going to have a baby," she accused them. Helen drew her breath in sharply. "Oh, no, not you too." "Of course," Clara Ford said complacently. "Everyone have babies, except Robert and Bobby and the ones like them. Jack and Mary and I have ours before we leave Venus. Have only one each, of course." "But why am I like this? How can I have a baby this way?" Dora's voice was shrill with anger and panic. "How else?" Jack asked calmly. A little chill of horror raced down Helen's spine. Could these odd girls really be telling the truth? Were they from Venus, as they insisted? She could just imagine them coming to Earth, on a flying saucer maybe, listening to the radio to learn the language, spying on us, but not learning as much as they thought they did. She choked off a giggle, an incipient hysteria, as another thought struck her. "Will I have one of those? "You already have baby," Patricia said. "Can't see how you have baby before we come with faneweed to make you green." Helen and Dora stared at her. "You mean," Helen finally was able to ask, that weed caused all this? That little weed?" "But that is what we tell you all along, only you always walk away angry." All those scientists working so hard, Helen realized bitterly, and all the time what they were looking for was literally under their feet. How could anyone have thought that the faneweed was responsible for anything but the bad smell they had finally become accustomed to? "Why didn't I listen to these girls, pay more attention to what they said?" Helen asked herself. She might have been able to prevent a lot of things that had happened. She got up from her chair and walked nervously about. Well, she couldn't change the past, but she could stop further evil from the faneweed. "I'll bet they don't have men on Venus," she said to Dora, "judging from the way they act. Then they'd have to have parthenogenetic births." She turned to Patricia. "Why did you come to Earth? And why just to Mimosa Beach?" "We try little place, what you call sample, before we change whole world," Patricia explained, and then she added sadly, "So many of our babies die. Not enough people left on Venus. We think maybe you like to come to Venus with us, so we make you as us." "That was very, very wicked of you," Dora said severely. The 4 Venusians shrugged resignedly. "Might as well go home," Mary Maroon said. "They don't like it our way." "And leave me like this?" Dora demanded shrilly. "Get rid of faneweed, be as before," Patricia assured her. "With a baby I'll have trouble accounting for," Dora said bitterly. "Oh, no, you don't. You stay right here. And Helen, don't you tell anybody that it's the faneweed. Then people from other places won't know about my baby, and it won't matter here as long as things are the way they are." "You come with us," Clara suggested wheedlingly. "You like Venus. Venus so pretty. No work, all happiness." "No work? No wonder the babies die," Dora exclaimed. Helen could see the yeast of reform beginning to work in Dora. The 4 Venusians looked puzzled. "They do that all the time," Helen thought irritably. Aloud she said, "Dora, of course I'll have to tell about the faneweed. There are others involved, you know." "I don't suppose," Dora interrupted, "that you girls know anything about diet. Those babies could probably be saved with little intelligence and some hard work." When the 4 Venusians left shortly thereafter for their home, they took along Dora Hastings, who had great plans for their planet. With the faneweed on Earth destroyed, the women and girls of Mimosa Beach returned to their original color. Even the parthenogenetic baby girls born as a result of the unfortunate experiment of the Venusians were white. "Well, the bad things went in pairs after all," Helen said to Robert when everything was normal again. "The faneweed was the fourth evil, though we didn't know it. And when we got rid of the faneweed, the greenness left. The Venusians went away, and I do hope Dora's all right." "She finally got what should be a lifetime job," Robert answered. He crossed his fingers, and looking out of a western window at Venus, bright against the darkening sky, added, "At least Venus is farther away than New York. That ought to help."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. The Masked World by Jack Williamson, originally published in Worlds of Tomorrow, October 1963. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The planet wore a mask. At 10 million miles it was a sullen yellow eye. At 1 million, a scarred and evil leer. Outside the smoking circle our landing jets had sterilized, it was a hideous veil of hairy black tentacles and huge sallow blooms hiding the riddle of its sinister genes. On most worlds that we astronauts had found, the life is vaguely like our own. Similar nucleotides are linked along similar helical chains of DNA, carrying similar genetic messages. A similar process replicates the chains when the cells divide to carry the complex blueprints for a particular root or eye or wing accurately down across 10,000 generations. But even the genes were different here, enormously complicated. Here the simplest seeming weed had more and longer chains of DNA than anything we had seen before. What was their message? We had come to read it with a new genetic microprobe. 100 precious tons of microscopic electronic gear. It was designed to observe and manipulate the smallest units of life. It could reach even those strange genes. That was our mission. Ours was the 7th survey ship to approach the planet. 6 before us had been lost without trace. We were to find out why. Our pilot was Lance Clandark, a lean, hard man, silent and as cold as the grey-cased microprobe. We hated him until someone learned why he had volunteered to come. His wife had been pilot of the ship before us. When we knew that, we began to hear the hidden tension in his tired voice, monotonously calling on every band. "Come in, 6. Come in, 6. 6 never came in. For 2 days we watched the planet, the shallow ditch our jets had dug, the charred stumps, the jungle beyond, the visible mask of those monstrous genes, rank, dark, utterly alien. At the 3rd dawn, Lance Clandark took 2 of us out in a copter. Flying a grid over the landing area, we mapped 6 shallow pockmarks on that scowling wilderness where our ships must have landed. We dropped into the newest crater, where black stumps jutted like broken teeth out of queerly bare red muck. A yellow scummed stream oozed across it. By the stream we found a fine-boned human skeleton. A nightmare plant stood guard beside the bones. Its thick leaves were strangely streaked, twisted with vegetable agony, half poisoned spine and half blighted bloom. Shapeless blobs of rotting fruit were falling from it over those slender bones. Lance Clandark stood up. Her turquoise thunderbird. He showed us the bit of black and silver and blue veined stone. Back on Terra, back when we were student pilots, we bought it from an Indian in an old town called Santa Fe. He bent again. "Lilith," he whispered. "Lilith, what killed you?" We found no other bones, nothing even to tell us what force or poison kept the creeping jungle back from that solitary plant. We left at dusk. Tenderly, Lance Clandark brought the gathered bones. Carefully we carried a few leaves and dried pods from that crazy sentinel plant. We found no other clue. Patiently, day by 40-hour day, we searched the other sites. We found jet marks and stumps and teeming weeds, but nothing like that tormented nightmare over Lilith Clandark's skeleton. We found no wreckage, nothing to show how the planet had murdered the lost expeditions. Day by eternal day, the unknown leered from the secret places of its genes. It was all vegetable. We saw no animal movement, heard no cry or insect hum. The silence became suffocating. Day after desperate day, we returned to the microprobe. The answer's in the genes, Lance Clandark whispered grimly. We've no other chance. He kept the probe running on the strangest genes of all, those from the plant nightmare that had grown beside his wife. They were like nothing else on the planet. The double-stranded chains of DNA were monstrously long. Many of the nucleotide links held copper or arsenic atoms. Queer, Lance kept muttering. No copper or arsenic in other plants here. I'd like to know why. He was running when we heard the woman scream. In that stifling quiet, her cry unnerved us all. We crowded down to the lock. Tattered, stained with blood-colored juices, she slipped through those coiled, constricting creepers. She splashed out into the open ditch, waving a filthy rag. Halfway to the ship, she fell into the mud. Lance Clandark led 3 of us to bring her in. She whimpered and looked up. Tears streaked the grime on her wasted face. "Lance," she gasped, "my dear." "Lilith," but he shrank back suddenly. "I found Lilith dead." "I am nearly dead." She tried weakly to get up. "You see, we're all marooned out there in the bush. Emergency landing. When we tried to get off, wrecked our astrogation gear. Need your spare astropilot." "Back," he swung on us. "Back aboard." "What's wrong?" We were stunned. "She's your wife. Aboard, instanter." We obeyed his deadly voice. "Help," she whispered faintly behind us in the mud. "Survivors. Need astropilot to plot our way home." The clanging lock cut off her voice. Angrily we turned on Lance Clandark. "Hold it," he snapped. "I'm not crazy. The planet is. Come along to the microprobe. I'm probing a seed from the plant we found by Lilith's bones. It puzzled me. So much of it was—" In spite of the tension, he had to grope for a word to express meaning. "Arbitrary. Those shapeless leaves, twisted stalk, that sterile seed. The copper and arsenic in those needless links. Too many genes had no function, no use at all. I just got the key when that thing screamed. The copper and arsenic atoms are not genetic instructions to the plant. They're a message to us, words replicated 1 trillion times and concealed in every cell of the plant." "Words?" someone whispered blankly. "Words in the atoms?" "Written in binary code." His scowl was bleakly triumphant. "That weed's a mutant, you see. The real Lilith formed the first cell with her microprobe. She left it, I suppose in her own body, as a message that no pseudo-Lilith could intercept." Outside that something screamed again. "Call each copper atom a dot," he whispered. "Call each arsenic a dash. Taken in order along the chains of DNA, they do encode a message. The computer's decoding it now." He punched a button, and the print of word. "To whoever comes, give no aid to anyone. Get off this planet. Its life is pseudomorphic. Don't let it leave. Just take my love to Lance Clandark, from Lilith, his wife, and get off this planet, fast." Outside it uttered a frantic, bubbling screech. We did get off the planet, and we expect to stay away.
The
End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Beast of Prey by J. Williams. Originally published in Astounding Science Fiction, August 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The little party came through the airlock bearing a limp figure on an improvised litter. "Who was it this time?" Fenner asked. Gosling pulled off the transparent hood that covered his head and face and unzipped his suit. He dug his fingers wearily into his eyes. "Bodkin," he said, "same as the others." He turned back to the group. "Get him right to the infirmary. Not that it'll do much good," he added in an undertone to Fenner. Fenner sighed, glancing at Bodkin on the litter. Behind the plastic protection of his mask, the man's face was a dark purple. His chest rose and fell spasmodically, and there was a faint line of foam on his lips. Gosling slipped off his suit and put it over his arm. Then he and Fenner walked together up the ramp to the common room. "I need a drink," he said, "and a smoke. It's awful not being able to smoke out there." "You should cultivate Aristotelian moderation," Fenner said with a grin. "It is far wiser in a Planet Biological Survey station." Moderation didn't do poor Bodkin any good. Gosling threw his suit into a corner and touched the stud on the dispenser. A lighted cigarette dropped into the trough. "Make me a drink, will you, Luke?" he asked, dropping into a reclining chair. Hagen, the chief of the station, came bouncing through the iris, walking as usual as if he had springs under his heels. He was a little plump man with a goatee, which he was tugging in a sort of ecstasy of exasperation. "Hello!" he cried. "Ha, Fenner! Listen, Gosling, I've just seen Bodkin. This is dreadful. 3 in 1 week." "I agree," Gosling said, taking the drink Fenner had made for him. "Let's pack up and go home, shall we?" Fenner relaxed on the middle of his spine in an easy chair and folded his hands together, peering over them at the chief, who sat down and stood up and sat down again. You'd never know that man was a capable organizer, he said to himself. Astonishing how people can betray their own appearances, seldom what they seem. Aloud he said, "Excuse me, Hagen, I want to ask Gosling, did you see any animals nearby when it happened?" Gosling shook his head. "I remembered what you said, but I didn't notice anything at all. It was just the same as in the other 2 cases. Well, almost the same." He drank and sat upright. "We were in Area B, you know. Bodkin was taking a series of photographs of the pollination of those red flowers by Lepidinus. Hakim and I were digging up bulbs and collecting the larvae that live at the roots. You know the ones I mean." Hagen nodded. "Go on." "Let's see. Staines and Petrucci were taking soil samples, and Bonder was chasing what he liked to call butterflies. It was very quiet. Those tall plants were just hanging limply. I remember Hakim saying, 'If we were home, I'd say we were going to have a storm.' I said something like, 'It'd be nice to see grass again for a change, even in a storm.' About that time, Bodkin got up and walked away from his cameras. I said, 'Where are you going?' He didn't answer. He took his head in his hands and stood still, and I knew immediately what it was. But before I could get to him, he collapsed." "Do you look for insects?" Fenner asked. "Yes, we thought of that at once. We looked to see if any of the Lepidina were on him, or any other bugs. There wasn't a thing, not a mark, not a sting or a puncture, nothing." He stopped and drew a long breath. "Well, then I thought about animals. I asked Bonder. He had been running around after all. He said he thought he saw the oil bushes moving, but he couldn't be sure. I set Staines and Petrucci to beating the bushes, but nothing turned up. I thought, then, if we could get Bodkin right back, something might be done for him." Hagen nodded slowly. "Quite right." As Gosling had been talking, the other had come in, and now Hagen turned to them. "What about Bodkin?" he asked. Bonder, the tall, thin, gloomy-looking entomologist, said, "Not much hope, I'm afraid." He tapped his head. The doctor says he's gone, like the others, alive but empty. Fenner sat up abruptly and slapped his hands together. I'm certain I'm right, he said. It must be some sort of animal. The fact that you didn't notice anything doesn't mean a thing. Any hostile animal would be exceedingly cautious and probably carefully camouflaged as well. The one thing you noticed, that it was so quiet, seems to me to indicate that something was prowling nearby. That is so, said Gorslein. You remember, Hakim? There were no bird calls, no rustlings, none of the amphibians cheeping. Dark-faced Hakim nodded. Fenner went on. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. It is possible, just possible, mind you, that this mental paralysis represents an emanation of some kind from a predator, a method of paralyzing its prey before attacking. Wasn't Bodkin off more or less by himself, away from the rest of you? That's right, Gorslein said. And the same was true of Lermontov and Parson? Both of them were alone, or at any rate a little apart from the rest? He got to his feet. I'll tell you one more thing I've noticed on my own field trips, not only in areas A and B, but also in the bush. You're familiar with this, Bodkin. You were with me all 4 times. But I haven't told you yet, Hagen. Those large banks of red flowers always grow near marshy areas. The marshes are thick with those furry reeds, the ones that look like giant bulrushes that have opened their seed pods. I found 2 things. 1, numbers of bones and exoskeletons among the flowers and the reeds, and 2, in one place, in the mud, a definite mark as if a heavy body had rested there. There was a scent spore. The tracker confirmed it. Hagen twisted the point of his goatee between 2 fingers. This is hardly proof of anything, he said. Now, 1 minute. I agree, it's interesting and provocative. Was the spore fresh? It was. Well, it gives us something to think of. We have no definite indication, however. No, of course not, Fenner said impatiently. But we can't go on this way, losing a man almost every time we send out a party. We'll be afraid to set foot outside after a while, and how the devil can we study ecology under these circumstances? We've got to know what we're up against. Hagen stood up, too, and suddenly his wiry little body assumed great poise and authority. Let me think about this, he said. We'll have a meeting tonight of the entire station personnel, and we'll discuss the matter. But I want time to consider all the aspects of it. He went to the iris. I want to look at Bodkin too, he said. Take it easy, gentlemen. There was a short silence after he had left. Then Gorslein, looking speculative at Fenner, said, Look, if you're right, you know, it's interesting that in the month we've been here we haven't seen a single large animal, not one larger than a rabbit. That doesn't mean much, said Hakim. Imagine a station being set up in, say, Sussex. In 1 month, barring the animals that go with civilization, you would hardly expect to find anything larger than a fox, and nowadays you'd be hard put to it to find a fox at that. Not quite apt, Hakim, Fenner said, because in Sussex a larger predator, man, has cleared away all his lesser rivals. Is it possible that something has swept this region clean, and perhaps only the last few survivors are now hanging about? Perhaps they're delighted to have us visit them, eh? He cracked the knuckles of his long bony fingers and strode restlessly to the iris. I'm going to think about it too, he said. Gorslein, as with a sort of clairvoyance, said, Don't go jumping into things, Luke. No, of course not. Fenner went out into the corridor. There was a faint odour of pine that blew from the air-conditioner and contrasted oddly with the almost hospital bareness of the hall. He walked down to his own room, musing, and glanced through the large window at the Orphic landscape. As the station's head ecologist, it was his duty to evaluate a great many aspects of the survey which might not be apparent even to the chief. For instance, assuming there was such a predator in the neighbourhood, what might be the probable results of trying to exterminate it? Or what was its relationship to a region in which there were so many winged creatures, birds they call them for the sake of simplicity, although they are actually flying marsupials and some very large insects, and so few ground animals that might serve as its prey? Was it itself winged, or, he asked himself, did its mind-paralyzing abilities serve to pluck birds out of the trees? He stiffened. Even while his mind had been busy with his subject, he had been automatically scanning the view with the involuntary precision of his profession. From the station, the cleared ground sloped away to a cluster of tall tree ferns whose upper branches, long and drooping like greatly oversized date palm fronds, brushed the mossy earth, and among those branches Fenner had seen something, long and glossy, move swiftly. All his attention focused at once on that spot. In the same instant, he whipped out the tiny binoculars he always carried in his side pocket and put them to his eyes. There was no doubt of it. Something was crouching in the shadow of the fronds. He had difficulty making it out, for it was a pale blue-green, but he had an impression of a heavy head and shoulders, and what appeared to be, incongruously, a bunch of feathers. Feather crest, he thought to himself with a grin. Indians? The creature moved again. It slid sinuously out of the shadows and crouched on the moss. Its colour then changed to a darker green dappled with brown. Fenner saw through the glass that the bunch of feathers was a pair of antennae, similar to those of the larger moths, that sprang from the top of its narrow head. It had short legs and a slender body covered with short fine fur. The general effect was that of a smallish mountain lion. As he watched, the creature turned on its own length somewhat as a snake might turn, and glided out of sight over the edge of a ridge. Fenner did not hesitate. Without a second thought, he snatched up his plastic suit and zipped it on. The air of Orpheus was breathable, but the suits had been designed to prevent contact with possibly poisonous spores, pollen, plants, or insects. He took down a Remington which was capable of delivering a bolt sufficient to stun a bear at 30 yards. His intention was to capture the beast for study, not to kill it. He also clipped to his belt a Mark III collecting net, a light, strong, fine mesh net in a capsule the size of an old-fashioned hand grenade. Then he let himself out the side lock and ran quickly across the moss towards the spot where the beast had vanished. The moss was crushed and flattened where the thing had lain, and he touched the selector of his wrist tracker and held it over the spot. The scent cell glowed, and the tiny needle swung over to point. Fenner followed it over the ridge and down the hill on the other side. The forest began at the foot of the hill, and beyond, looming above the foliage, were the peaks of distant mountains, hazy in the faintly greenish air. Somewhere beyond those peaks the Archaeological Survey was at work, and there was something comforting and neighbourly in the thought. The light was always crepuscular here, and because of the colour of Orpheus' sun, the sky had a green tint as of a summer pool. This green, against which the dark brown moss and lighter colours of the trees shimmered like waterweed, was extremely restful and yet alien, so that in 4 weeks Fenner had not been able to accustom himself to it. He felt always as if he were walking in a dream, as if his limbs were weighted and languid, although in fact the purity of the air made him feel more vigorous than ever before in his 45 years. He entered the forest, which here was composed chiefly of a grey-stemmed tree, very slender and rigid, with a crown of glossy red-brown leaves. The tall boles rose straight out of the moss, and there was little underbrush, so that it was almost like a planted park. The needle of the tracker led him on a winding course, but he was not afraid of becoming lost, for if by some mischance his homing compass, which was always set for the station, should fail, he had only to follow his own footsteps back with the tracker. The trail led for 1/2 mile or so through the grey trees. Now and then one of the long-tailed birds flashed like a shining jewel across some cleared space, the yellow-green sunlight glistening on its fur. Once in a while a giant jointed thing, like a centipede, fluttered lazily past on wide, scaly wings. From the tree-tops came whistles and hoarse calls. He came at last to the bank of a rushing stream, and the needle halted. The beast had taken to the water.
Fenner decided to cast up and down the bank for a little way, in case it had come out on the same side again. He had walked only a short distance, when suddenly he had the distinct feeling that he was under observation. He glanced down at the tracker. The needle had swung over to the right. He turned slowly in that direction, at the same time cautiously raising his gun. In the corner of his eye, movement flickered. He braced himself and tapped the firing button. A halo of white light surrounded the muzzle, and there was the dull crump of the discharge. He saw a flurry in the leaves of the oil bushes that grew here and there among the trees. Leaves and bits of branches flew. A mottled grey and brown shape darted like a streak away between the trees. Fenner ran after it. He began to pant for breath, and sweat dripped into his eyes. The trail led upstream now, and soon the stream grew more sluggish and broadened, and the grey trees thinned away. There were dank, twisted plants here, some of them 8 or 10 feet high, and wide stretches of reeds between which gleamed brown water and patches of oily mud. A chorus of chirps sounded from the marsh, dying away at his approach and starting again when he moved on. Without warning, the needle of the tracker spun round, and Fenner stopped. At the same instant, a lithe form shot out of the reeds toward him. He dodged, throwing himself to the ground. The beast bounded past him and turned. Fenner rolled over and sat up, groping in the moss for his gun. For a moment they regarded each other, Fenner trying to bring his gun into position. The creature, he saw, had a wedge-shaped face, narrower at the top where the feathery antennae were, wide at the jaw which now gaped, showing a double row of small but sharp teeth. Its eyes were round and large, and bulged as a frog's do. They were completely dark purple, showing no trace of white. They swiveled forward to stare at him, and as he braced his weapon, the beast made a coughing sound and sprang into the reeds. All was quiet again. Fenner got up slowly, holding his gun ready, and glanced at his tracker. There was a crack across the face of it, and the needle was motionless. It had struck against a stone when he fell. He tried to see into the reeds, but he knew it was hopeless. By now, the animal must have changed its colour and pattern, and without the tracker to guide him, he could distinguish it nothing. He commenced to walk upstream, in the hope of somehow flanking it. He unclipped his net capsule and held it ready. It seemed to him that there was a slight movement in the marsh. He stopped. There was no sound about him. The chirpings in the water had ceased, and there was a quality of hush in the air, an almost ominous tenseness, as though the marsh itself were waiting for him. He began to feel a little frightened. He looked from side to side. Where was the thing? He had not realized how much it depended on the wrist tracker. He found that he was trembling, and the perspiration stung his eyes so that he had to keep blinking. Cautiously, he slipped one of his gloved hands under the edge of the hood and wiped his eyes. Something rustled slightly in the oil bushes. These were thick clumps of low shrubs, their branches a naked and repellent pink, covered with spiny leaves on which a thick, pungent oil gathered during each day. It apparently served to attract small insects which the leaves closed over in much the same way as the Venus flycatcher on Earth. Fenner went towards the bushes, moving very slowly, his gun tight against his hip, his net capsule in his left hand. There was nothing in the bushes, and yet he thought the moss beneath them looked flattened, as if something had lain there watchfully. Were there two of the beasts? Was one still in the marsh among the reeds, while its mate stalked him here? His spine crept, and he glanced over his shoulder. He went softly on. Beyond the bushes, the ground rose again in a high bank that overlooked the marsh, and all along this bank grew the lustrous red flowers. They were larger than poppies, emphatically vermilion, so that they stood out among the dark greens and browns. They had hairy stalks as thick as a man's wrist, and all about them buzzed the snouted little beetles the survey team had named Leptorinus. Fenner stood before the flowers thoughtfully. Their leaves were broad and close to the ground, but underneath one of them he could see a small cage of white, the clean rib bones of some animal. He went closer, bending to peer. Brittle bones, some with rags of skin clinging to them, were scattered here and there on the ground. There were also the empty wing cases of some very large flying insects, as big as crows, spotted yellow and black. If he was right, this was the lair of the beast itself, and just beyond these flowers, and even among them, itself a vermilion now, the thing might be lying. He straightened cautiously, holding himself ready for a sudden attack, and as he came erect, he was conscious of a curious light-headedness. It was like inhaling too much oxygen. His ears rang, and he felt giddy. He took a step, and it was as if the ground heaved under his feet like a living thing. A group of flowers before his eyes appeared to increase in size and to sway towards him. He shook his head to dispel the illusion. He staggered a few steps away, and it seemed to him that the flowers reached after him on stalks that became incredibly elongated, like red worms, bristling all their length with coarse hairs. At that precise instant, the beast charged. Fenner saw it in mid-air, and in his dizziness it seemed to move very slowly, so slowly that his automatic movement with the net capsule was, by comparison, leisurely. He squeezed the capsule. The net shot out and opened in the air. It missed the beast by an inch or so and fell among the flowers. The beast struck Fenner full in the chest and bowled him over. Its antennae bent towards his face. All his weight rested on him. Its jaws were open. He closed his eyes. Gosselin and Hakim, using their wrist trackers, found them less than half an hour later. Hakim, a little in the rear, threw up his gun, but Fenner snapped, "Don't shoot!" "Are you all right?" Gosselin said, incredulously. Fenner was sitting up with one arm around the neck of the beast, which, at Hakim's movement, had recoiled. "I'm fine," he said. "Speak softly." What is that thing?" Hakim asked. Fenner looked at the animal. It was now brown, with a bluish tinge from the surface of his plastic suit. He patted its head, and the thing put out a slender tongue and licked his mask. "I can tell you what it isn't," he grinned. "It isn't very dangerous. Judging by its teeth and general appearance, I suspect it hunts amphibians in the swamp, or perhaps goes after water creatures like an otter." "So it does live in the swamp," said Gosselin. "Yes. Why haven't we seen it before?" "It's timid," Fenner replied. "There were always so many of us, and we made so much noise. Alone as I was, it was less frightened of me, although I must have scared it by firing at it. I thought it was stalking me. As a matter of fact," he added, "it was stalking me, but not for the purpose I imagined." "What do you mean?" Hakim said. "Why, appearances are deceiving. If a man who had never seen a dog before were to see one jump up on its master, he might think the creature was attacking the man. Putting two and two together, I was sure this animal lived among the red flowers and was stalking me for its dinner. But it was stalking me, and it rushed at me, only because it wanted to protect me." "Protect you? From what?" "Well, I was right, you see. There is a beast of prey here which uses a form of mind paralysis in order to stun its victims." He motioned over its shoulder. "Those are the real predators, those red flowers." He looked at the lovely bank of vermilion and shuddered. "I should judge that their use of the mind paralysis is automatic, but we are too big and too many for them to actually attack us. That is why, although poor Bodkin and the others succumbed, the flowers never tried to go for them. If you look over there, you'll see the remains of my Mark III net. It fell amongst them, and they devoured most of it before they realized that it wasn't alive." He stood up. The beast nuzzled his calf, and he stroked its neck behind the feathery stalks. "I can't tell you how it's done," he went on, "because it's only just happened to me. We'll have to study it, but apparently this creature has the ability, by means of these antennae of his, to counter or nullify the mind-destroying waves of the flowers." "Great heavens!" Gosselin exclaimed. "Then it must have been lurking, One like it, at any rate, each time we came near the flowers. Yes, it would have saved Bodkin, Fenner said, but it was afraid of the rest of you. You were so many, so noisy. But why should it try to save us? Hakim said. If it's an animal, I mean. Fenner shrugged. Why did the first dog become domesticated, and how did it happen? Perhaps, he said softly, there were once other beings here who were its masters. One thing is clear to me. This creature is very intelligent, and like all intelligent creatures, it has a profound need. For food, you mean, or shelter? Oh, of course, for food, shelter, propagation, and so on. No, said Fenner, smiling. It's a deeper need than that. What? Affection, said Fenner, and he set off walking with the beast at his heels. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And don't forget to check out the channel. There's hundreds of stories. Hundreds of stories.